Beneath the Iraqi desert, clay tablets sleep in silence, each one carrying secrets pressed into mud 5,000 years ago. But here's what keeps archaeologists awake at night. This first civilization appeared fully formed, with no slow evolution, no trial and error. They already knew the stars, already mastered mathematics, already understood forces we're only now rediscovering. What if everything we call the beginning was actually the last echo of something far older? What if the Sumerians weren't inventing civilization, but remembering it? The air above southern Iraq shimmers with ancient heat. Sand the color of old bone stretches toward a horizon that has watched empires rise and crumble. Yet beneath this desolation, fragments of clay still hold their breath, waiting. Each wedge-shaped mark, pressed into wet earth 5 millennia ago, preserved a truth we've spent centuries trying to hear. The oldest written words in human history don't describe primitive survival or simple needs. They speak of cosmic order, divine mathematics, and a flood that erased an entire world. They speak of teachers who descended from the sky and kings who ruled for impossible spans of time. They speak as though remembering something that came before them, something we've forgotten entirely. This is the story of Sumer, the civilization that should not exist, yet somehow became the foundation of everything we know. When British and French archaeologists first drove their spades into the Mesopotamian plains in the late 1800s, they expected to find the crude beginnings of human society. Instead, they unearthed something that defied every assumption about how civilizations emerge. The tablets they discovered weren't hesitant scratches of a newborn culture learning to express itself. They were sophisticated, systematic, and strangely complete. The Sumerians appeared in history around 3500 BCE with their language fully formed, their cities geometrically precise, and their understanding of astronomy already refined to a degree that wouldn't be matched for thousands of years. No evolutionary steps, no gradual invention, just sudden, complex, and deeply aware. Their cuneiform writing system wasn't merely an alphabet, it was a geometry of meaning. Triangular impressions arranged to hold both sound and symbol, recording everything from medical treatments to star movements with meticulous care. They documented the phases of Venus with precision we only confirmed with modern telescopes. They tracked Jupiter and Mars across the night sky. They divided time and space using base 60 mathematics that still governs our clocks and compasses today. History favors slow progress, one tool leading to the next. But the Sumerians shattered that comfortable narrative. They built irrigation systems, ziggurats reaching toward the heavens, and maintained trade networks spanning thousands of miles. They created the first written laws, the first schools, the first pharmacopoeia. Everything arrived at once, as if downloaded from an earlier source. And their own records suggest exactly that. The Sumerians spoke of a time before kings, before floods, when knowledge was given, not discovered. They named their teachers not as mortal men, but as beings who descended from the sky. Among the thousands of clay tablets recovered from ancient Mesopotamia, one document stands apart in its strangeness: the Sumerian king list. It reads like a historical record, listing rulers, cities, and dates with bureaucratic precision. But then the numbers become impossible. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. This opening line, carved more than 4,000 years ago, launches into a chronicle where kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. Scholars had struggled with this document for over a century. Were these numbers symbolic, astronomical, allegorical? Or were the Sumerians preserving something they themselves no longer fully understood, memory already fading when they pressed it into clay? What makes the king list so unsettling is its context. These weren't mythological poems or religious hymns. They were administrative records, written in the same precise hand that tallied grain harvests and temple offerings. To the Sumerians, this list was history, not fantasy. The cities mentioned in these ancient sections, Eridu, Uruk, Kish are real. Archaeologists have excavated their ruins, finding layer upon layer of construction, stretching back almost 8,000 years. Beneath the oldest known structures lie even older foundations, sealed by ancient silt deposits that suggest massive flooding around 2900 BCE. The pattern encoded in these impossible rains appears elsewhere too. The numbers frequently appear as multiples of 3,600. The Sumerian unit, called asar, used to measure astronomical cycles. Was this king list actually a celestial calendar, disguised as political history? Were these rulers not individuals but epochs, their reigns marking processions of the stars? Then comes the flood. Then the flood swept over. No explanation, no moral judgment, just an event that resets everything. After the waters recede, kingship descends from heaven once more, and the measurements become human again. Nearly every ancient culture shares this same pattern. Divine rulers, catastrophic flood, new beginning. The Egyptian Turin papyrus lists gods and demigods ruling before human pharaohs. Hindu Puranas describe vast yugas ages lasting tens of thousands of years. Mayan texts speak of earlier worlds destroyed by water. Always the same rhythm, as if humanity remembers the melody, but has forgotten the words. Perhaps the king list preserves something beyond individual reigns, a compressed memory of vast spans of time, of ages when the world operated under different rules. Or perhaps it's exactly what it claims to be, a record of the time before time as we know it, when the boundary between heaven and earth was not yet fixed. The Sumerians didn't just glance at the night sky in wonder. They measured it, recorded it, and aligned their entire civilization according to its rhythms with a precision. That seems impossible for people who had just emerged from the Stone Age. Their temples weren't randomly placed. Every major ziggurat was oriented to celestial points, the rising of specific stars, solstice alignments, the places where Venus appeared at dawn. The Great Ziggurat of Ur, built nearly 6,000 years ago, faces the cardinal directions with almost perfect accuracy, a feat of architectural awareness that implies both mathematical sophistication and centuries of systematic observation. Among the thousands of tablets recovered from Mesopotamia, a subset stands out. The Mo, Apin tablets, astronomical compendiums believed to preserve Sumerian knowledge dating back to 3000 BC or earlier. These texts list constellations, equinoxes, solstices, and the precise rising and setting times of planets. They calculate the synodic cycle of Venus 58.92 days, with an error margin of less than a single day. How? We needed telescopes to achieve that accuracy. The Sumerians also understood the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that takes roughly 72 years to shift 1 degree, measuring that requires continuous observation spanning centuries. Yet their inscriptions already reflect awareness of this cosmic drift, as though they had inherited records from observers who came long before. Their cosmology was mathematical. Each major god corresponded to a planet. Anu was heaven itself. Enlil ruled the air. Enki governed the deep waters. The goddess Inanna, associated with Venus, descended into the underworld and rose again, a story that perfectly mirrors Venus' disappearance and reappearance in the sky. Even the term Anunnaki, often translated as those who from heaven to earth came, can also mean the numbered heavenly bodies. For the Sumerians, the universe wasn't a collection of random objects. It was a living system whose movements were sacred, whose numbers were divine. They didn't separate astronomy from religion or mathematics from myth. Everything was one interconnected pattern. In one tablet from the library of Nineveh, a scribe carefully drew Jupiter's path across the night sky using a mathematical system that modern astronomers recognized as a rudimentary form of calculus. Another describes the Earth's shadow across the moon during an eclipse. These weren't religious metaphors. They were geometric observations dressed in poetic language. Their base 60 numbering system allowed them to divide the heavens into 360 degrees and measure time with extraordinary precision. Every hour we count, every minute that passes, still echoes their design. Our clocks, our calendars, our way of measuring circles, all inherited from Sumer. But where did this knowledge begin? Did a culture just emerging from reed huts and mud bricks truly develop such refined astronomy on their own? Or were they, as their own records suggest, remembering something already known? Restoring what had been lost? Beneath the temples and palaces of ancient Sumer, archaeologists have found traces of knowledge that shouldn't exist at civilization's dawn. Evidence of technologies appearing before their supposed invention. Formulas that read like early chemistry. Tools and techniques that suggest an inheritance rather than an innovation. The Sumerians possessed a word for knowledge, me, that didn't mean learning as we understand it. It meant something closer to fundamental codes or cosmic formulas. To them, science wasn't invention. It was memory. When excavations at Eridu and Ur uncovered tablets detailing ziggurat construction, researchers expected rough sketches. Instead, they found precise measurements, proportional ratios, and geometric calculations described in base 60 mathematics. The architects understood volumes, slopes, and weight distribution with remarkable sophistication, as though working from an engineer's handbook passed down from a vanished source. Their medicine was equally advanced. One tablet from Nippur catalogs over 200 medicinal plants, organized by therapeutic function. Another describes mixing sulfur, copper, and oil to create compounds used in purification rituals, formulas that resemble early chemistry. There are even references to Nagar, translated as the shining liquid, which some scholars believe refers to distilled mercury, though such a material shouldn't have been known in that era. Metallurgy poses similar puzzles. By 3000 BCE, Sumerians were smelting copper and experimenting with bronze alloys. Yet traces of hardened bronze appear in strata that predate this timeline. Their cylinder seals depict saws, drills, and bellows tools, suggesting a level of craftsmanship unexplained by the artifacts we've actually recovered. Then there's the mathematics itself. The base 60 system they used allowed for complex fractions, astronomical divisions, and time calculations far beyond agricultural needs. To divide the heavens into 360 degrees, to measure hours into 60 minutes, this demands not just observation but precedent, an existing framework. Some scholars have noted that Sumerian technical vocabulary contains loan words from an unknown, non-Semitic language traces of an extinct scientific lexicon. Assyriologist George Rue called it the substrate of invention. We don't know who spoke it, only that its remnants survive like linguistic fossils embedded in Sumerian speech. Perhaps these words belong to whoever the Sumerians themselves remembered, the civilization before the flood. Their mythology supports this interpretation. The god Enki doesn't invent civilization's arts. He transmits them. In the myth of Enki and Inanna, he possesses the mean, divine tablets containing the codes for music, architecture, law, and crafts. When Inanna steals these tablets and brings them to her city, civilization awakens. The story is spiritual, yes, but also strangely literal. It describes the transfer of knowledge from an older source to a younger one. Even their art hides mathematical secrets. The dimensions of their statues often conform to harmonic ratios, the same proportional systems celebrated in classical Greek sculpture. The temples of Uruk and Eridu were built on scales of 3-4-5, the simplest form of right-angle construction. Beauty, structure, and sound were all manifestations of the same universal pattern. And this pattern wasn't unique to Mesopotamia. Around the same centuries, Egypt's earliest temples used similar measurements. The Indus Valley cities followed strict geometric grids. Why did complex urban design appear simultaneously across such distant regions around 3000 BCE? Why not earlier or later? Some call this the synchronization problem, the improbable convergence of mathematical consciousness across continents. Perhaps it reflects a shared awakening of the human mind. Or perhaps it reflects something else. Fragments of a common blueprint, remembered differently by each culture, each rebuilding from the ruins of what came before. If clay could speak, the archives of Nippur and Nineveh would tell us everything. These weren't mere collections of administrative records. They were deliberate acts of preservation, desperate attempts to ensure that what was known would not be forgotten. Nippur was never a royal capital. It had no armies, no king, no empire. Yet it was the spiritual heart of Sumer, home to the great temple of Enlil. Beneath its ruins, archaeologists uncovered tens of thousands of clay tablets, an ancient library so vast that scholars are still deciphering fragments today. What they found shattered assumptions about ancient ignorance. There were poems predating the Bible by more than a millennium, star charts mapping the heavens, surgical instructions, philosophical reflections on fate and justice, thoughts so familiar they feel almost modern. The scribes of Nippur weren't just record keepers. They were guardians of continuity. In their schools, young apprentices spent years memorizing hundreds of signs, learning to read and write in a system so complex that mastering it was an act of devotion. The clay tablet was their sacred bridge to the past. The range of subjects preserved is staggering. Medical ethics. Do not cause harm by your hand. Do not withhold the remedy. Anatomical observations encoded in ritual language. Astronomical records tracking stars, moons, and eclipses. For a civilization we call first, their intellectual horizon was already immense. When the great flood of history finally drowned Sumer cities through war, erosion, and time, Nippur's tablets survived because they were clay. Fire and burial preserved them where papyrus would have crumbled to dust. Centuries later, when Austin Henry Layard and Hormuzd Razam began excavating at Nineveh in the mid-1800s, they discovered something even greater, the Library of Ashurbanipal. Though built more than 1,000 years after Nippur's golden age, it was its heir over 30,000 tablets gathered and copied by Assyrian scribes who understood they were preserving dying knowledge. When the palace burned, the heat hardened these tablets into permanence, creating an archive of cosmic scope. Among them, fragments of the Epic of Gilgamesh, flood narratives predating Genesis, omens, star catalogs, hymns to Inanna and Enki, and lists of kings stretching back into myth. One colophon reads, "From old tablets, damaged, restored with care." Another bears the quiet signature, "I have written what was left to." These words echo across millennia like a lament. The scribes knew they were working at the end of something, preserving fragments of a world already fading. The content hints at an intellectual lineage that defies categorization. The Enuma Anu Enlil, thousands of lines devoted to celestial omens, is systematic observation disguised as poetry. Behind the myths lies data spanning generations. Most haunting is the so-called Tablet of the Great Flood, telling of a man chosen to survive the deluge by building a vessel and preserving life. The parallels to Noah are unmistakable, but this version is older, perhaps the original. The flood, it says, swept over like wind, erasing kings and cities. When the waters receded, kingship descended again from heaven. The cycle resumed. The story is both myth and record, memory and metaphor. These weren't written for us. They were written for continuity, for a future the scribes hoped would still understand. Each tablet was a time capsule, a plea against erasure. They must have known empires fall and tongues vanish. They wrote anyway, trusting clay more than stone. And perhaps they were right. Long after their cities collapsed, their words endure. Their numerals define our clocks. Their geometry shapes our buildings. Their myths live in our religions. Standing before these tablets today under museum lights, It's difficult not to feel the pull of that ancient intention to remember. They knew knowledge could vanish. They had seen it happen before. Every wedge in clay was an act of defiance against the flood. But if they were merely preserving what they already knew, what then had they lost? What deeper archive still lies buried, waiting? In the oldest stories ever written, humanity is not born, it is made. The Sumerians told of gods who grew weary of endless labor and decided to create servants who could bear the burdens of the world. Enki, god of wisdom, and Ninhursag, lady of life, gathered divine essence and mixed it with the clay of the earth. From this fusion came the first humans, Lulu Amelu, servants who could work the fields. It's a tale half myth, half memory. Yet behind its poetry hides something radical, the idea that life itself may be the result of design. The Atrahasis epic, carved into tablets long before Genesis, describes the divine assembly. Enlil, their leader, laments the noise of lesser beings laboring in the fields. Enki offers a solution: fashion a new race to work in their stead. But raw clay is lifeless. To animate it, they need something of themselves. So they sacrifice a god, mixing his blood with the earth, dividing his spirit among humankind. Through this divine transgression, humans are born both mortal and sacred, both servant and heir. What were the Sumerians trying to tell us? Were they speaking in pure allegory, or recording something remembered from a time so far removed that only mythic language could contain it? The phrase "mixed with the blood of the gods" appears again and again across Mesopotamian texts. In the Enuma Elish, the genetic essence of the divine is described as life-bearing fluid, seed of heaven. The same idea echoes in Egypt, Greece, and the Hebrew Bible. They believed the human body carried fragments of something older, something celestial. Modern readers separate myth from science. Yet when examined closely, the distance narrows. The Sumerians described a process of creation involving the manipulation of flesh and blood, matter infused with intention. In the myth of Enki and Ninmah, the gods experiment repeatedly, creating beings that fail one blind, one mute, one unable to reproduce until finally they succeed. The story reads like an ancient parable of trial and error, a poetic reflection of some forgotten knowledge of anatomy or heredity. Their texts often speak of me as blueprints for reality. Every element of existence, from kingship to weaving to fertility, had its own me, a divine formula maintaining cosmic balance. To possess the me was to possess the power of creation itself. In another fragmentary text, Enki instructs his priests to guard the blood that makes the clay speak. That line, enigmatic and strange, lingers like an echo of biochemical truth. Blood indeed carries language of its own, DNA, the molecular code dictating life's form. Could it be that what we read as divine metaphor once described an ancient intuition, not knowledge of molecules as we understand them, but an awareness that life's structure resides within blood, within pattern? Civilizations across the ancient world share this imagery. The Egyptians said humanity was formed from Ra's tears. Greeks spoke of Prometheus shaping man from clay. The Hebrews echoed Sumer almost word for word. God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. The story migrated, transformed, survived, but its core remained, the mingling of dust and spirit, matter and code. What does it mean that the oldest written civilization begins with such a story? Perhaps it was simply a way to explain consciousness, to reconcile human purpose with the reality of toil. Or perhaps it was memory handed down through floods and ruins, a recollection of when beings older than us walked the earth. The Sumerians called them Anunnaki, those who came from the heavens. In later texts, they're described as teachers who gave humanity agriculture, astronomy, and metallurgy. To some, they're mythic archetypes. To others, they're forgotten teachers of prehistory. One hymn from Nippur writes, "Hail, who mixed the essence of heaven with the clay of the Abzu, who gave to man the image of the gods. The phrase image of the gods, Salmuilani, carries the same resonance as the later Hebrew Tzlam Elohim. The parallels are too precise to dismiss. What we call theology may, at its roots, be the language of remembrance. There is melancholy in this myth. The same gods who created humanity also cursed them with mortality. To be made from divine blood was to contain divinity, but also to be forever cut off from it. The story is one of both gift and exile. Every Sumerian prayer carries that tone of yearning for return, for reunion, for remembrance. If their myths were memories, perhaps they were mourning a separation that once occurred, a fall not of sin, but of knowledge. Something was divided long ago, and ever since we've tried to piece it back together. The Sumerians saw no conflict between creation and science, between gods and clay. They saw only one story endlessly retold, the universe awakening to itself through the vessel of flesh. The blood of the gods flows in us still, they would have said, not as myth, but as reminder that our origins are both earthly and cosmic, both known and forgotten. There is a strange quiet that follows catastrophe, a silence so complete that even memory hesitates to speak. The Sumerians knew that silence well. They called it the day the waters swept over the land. To them, it wasn't merely a storm or flood. It was the eraser of a world, the cleansing of an age that had grown too loud, too full of its own creations. What remained afterward was not just ruin but amnesia. Humanity began again, they said, smaller, humbler, haunted by echoes of what came before. In the Epic of Ziusudra, one of the earliest flood narratives known, the story unfolds in fragments carved into clay around 1700 BCE, but rooted in far older oral memory. The gods, disturbed by humanity's noise, decree destruction. Only Ziusudra, a king and priest of Shuruppak, receives warning from the god Enki. Build a vessel of strong walls and sealed pitch. Take into it the seed of all living things. Then the rain begins not gentle, but endless. Rivers rise. The sea swallows the plains. For 7 days and nights, the world vanishes beneath the flood. When the waters recede, Ziusudra releases a dove. It does not return. He knows the earth has emerged again. In gratitude, he offers sacrifice. The gods, moved or perhaps regretful, grant him immortality and place him in the land beyond the rivers. This story predates the biblical flood by over a millennium. Its bones are the same: divine wrath, chosen survivor, vessel of life, renewal. Yet the Sumerian version carries no moral lesson, no condemnation. It reads like a geological memory, a record of an event so profound it burned itself into the human timeline. Archaeology hesitates to affirm such myths. And yet, beneath the ruins of Mesopotamian cities, there is evidence. In the 1920s, Sir Leonard Woolley excavated Ur and discovered a deep layer of sterile silt-clean river mud nearly 2 meters thick, sandwiched between layers of habitation. He found similar deposits at Kish and Shuruppak, dated roughly to 2900 BCE. Woolley described it simply, a flood of such magnitude that it destroyed life and left the land empty. To those who lived it, it must have felt like the end of the world. Perhaps the memory reaches even farther, back to the violent end of the last ice age, when meltwater floods reshaped entire continents. In every corner of the ancient world, the same pattern persists. Myths of great waters, survivors in boats, the rebirth of humankind. From India's Manu to Greece's Deucalion, from the Aztec Coxcox to the biblical Noah, the story repeats like a scar in the collective mind. The Sumerians described it not merely as disaster, but as transition. The flood was the dividing line between the antediluvian kings, those mysterious rulers who reigned for tens of thousands of years, and the mortal kings who came after. It was the veil between myth and history. Before the flood, the gods walked openly among men. Afterward, they withdrew. The connection between heaven and earth was severed. Humanity was left to remember and to misremember. Some tablets hint the flood wasn't entirely natural. In one fragment, the gods debate among themselves. Should humankind be destroyed? Enlil, weary of the noise of cities, argues for annihilation. Enki pleads for mercy. It's a dialogue of opposing forces, order and compassion, control and chaos. When the deluge comes, it feels less like accident and more like decision. The phrase used to describe it, the Great Decree, suggests intention. Others see in this story traces of something even more complex, a metaphor for cycles of civilization. Perhaps the flood wasn't literal inundation, but symbolic description of an event that reset human culture. A comet impact, a climate shift, a collapse of knowledge. Geological evidence hints at sudden sea level rises and cosmic impacts near the end of the Pleistocene. To survivors, it would have seemed like divine punishment, incomprehensible power. And so they remembered it as cleansing, one that washed away both sin and science. If the flood erased a former world, then every artifact the Sumerians later buried was a fragment of that forgotten age. Their writing, mathematics, star charts, each feels like an attempt to retrieve something half-remembered. They weren't inventing civilization. They were rebuilding after the water. Even their myths read like recovery manuals. Enki teaches survivors how to plant, how to measure, how to keep time. Knowledge, in their view, was not discovery, but restoration. There's a line from the Epic of Gilgamesh that feels almost like confession. Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, tells Gilgamesh, "What you call the gods were once men of great name. They remembered the secrets of the deep." It's a strange sentence, suggesting that divinity and humanity are not separate species, but states of memory. The flood didn't just drown the earth, it drowned that memory. What remained was the echo. Even today, when rain falls over the plains of southern Iraq, it's said the soil releases a faint metallic scent, as though the ground itself recalls the sea that once covered it. To the ancients, survival was not victory. It was responsibility. Ziusudra wasn't rewarded with paradise, but exile sent to dwell in the distance, to remember what others would forget. The flood was both punishment and preservation, ensuring that at least one thread of memory would remain. Sometimes what survives the flood is not the body, but the memory. The Sumerians believed knowledge could drown and still return, hidden in fragments scattered across the world. They called such remnants Shuba, pieces of the whole. To them, these fragments were more than relics. They were fingerprints of the world that had come before the waters. When explorers first began unearthing ancient sites across the Near East in the 19th century, they weren't just finding cities, they were finding anomalies. Objects that didn't belong to their assigned ages. Technologies that seemed misplaced. Artifacts whose origins no one could explain. In the ruins of Nineveh and Uruk, they found gears carved into stone, lenses ground from quartz, sculptures depicting figures in intricate robes patterned with symbols that didn't correspond to any known writing system. Most finds were quietly removed to museum vaults, labeled curiosities or mistakes. Yet a few sparked controversies that have never truly ended. In the 1930s, reports emerged of a small egg-shaped object unearthed near Baghdad, made of terracotta and capped with a copper cylinder. It contained traces of acid corrosion. Some researchers proposed it could generate an electric charge, a primitive battery 2,000 years older than it should have been. Others dismissed it as coincidence, a ritual vessel or storage container. But the possibility remains. The ancients may have known ways to harness forces we only rediscovered millennia later. Even now, it sits behind glass in the Baghdad Museum, its function unresolved, its silence heavier than explanation. There are other whispers. In Turkey's Anatolian highlands, far from Sumer, a site called Gogikli Tepe reveals megalithic pillars carved with animals and celestial symbols, more than 11,000 years old, 6,000 years before Sumer's rise. The site, predates agriculture. Yet its builders arranged stones, weighing tons into geometric enclosures aligned with the stars. No writing, no metal, no cities. Yet an understanding of astronomy and engineering that seems out of place. Archaeologists call it the first temple, but to the Sumerians, who emerged long after, such a site would have been described another way, a remnant from before the flood. Among Sumerian scholars, there has always lingered an unspoken theory. Their civilization's sudden appearance wasn't spontaneous, but inherited. Their myths say as much. After the flood, Enki gives to the survivors, the black-headed people, the tools of life, writing, measurement, agriculture, law. He doesn't invent these things. He restores them. The very language of Sumer hints at this restoration. Words for creation often derive from roots, meaning to reawaken or to rebuild. Theirs was a civilization of remembering, not beginning. Archaeological layers support this intuition. Beneath the oldest known cities lie still older layers washed by ancient silt. Radiocarbon dates suggest settlements more than 8,000 years old. In some strata, tools appear that shouldn't exist. Advanced metallurgy, fine ceramics, architectural precision. None fits neatly within the model of linear progress. Instead, it suggests a broken timeline, a prehistory erased, then half recovered. Every culture inherits its ghosts. For the Sumerians, those ghosts were the gods themselves. The Anunnaki were worshipped as distant deities, but remembered as teachers, those who had walked among humans before the flood. In one haunting tablet from Nippur, the scribe records a vision. I saw the stone temples of the deep, their doors sealed by the waters. I saw lights beneath the sea that never fade. Scholars translate it as metaphor, but its imagery echoes across mythologies. The submerged realms, the lost cities, the knowledge beneath the waves. The Greeks called it Atlantis. The Egyptians spoke of Zep Tepi the first time. The Sumerians simply called it before the flood. Perhaps they were all remembering the same event, fragmented through the lenses of geography and time. Some geologists now suggest that such a flood did occur around 12,000 years ago, when glacial melt caused catastrophic sea level rise, submerging vast coastlines. Entire cultures, if they existed there, would have been erased, leaving only memories passed down through survivors who rebuilt inland. Could the builders of Göbekli have been among them? Could their descendants have carried fragments of that vanished science into Sumer, Egypt, and beyond? The evidence is circumstantial, but the pattern persists. Civilization appears not as invention, but as rediscovery. There are artifacts that seem to confirm this continuity. In Iraq and Iran, archaeologists have found drill holes in Diorite 1 of the hardest stones on Earth, smooth and precise, as though made by rotary tools. In Egypt, identical markings appear on granite and basalt. The same techniques, the same signatures, separated by thousands of miles. Coincidence, perhaps? Or memory in ancient technology, surviving through fragments of craft? Even language carries traces of this inheritance. The Sumerian word ti means both life and rib. In their creation myth, woman is made from the rib of the first man in image that later appears in Genesis. But ti also means to repair. Thus woman is not a creation, but a restoration, a fragment made whole again. The play of meanings reveals the deeper Sumerian view. Life itself is the process of repair, of remembering what was lost. If every fragment points toward something greater, some hidden pattern of memory, then how much of our own civilization is built upon foundations we no longer remember? Every civilization leaves a trace of its voice. Yet the voice of Sumer stands alone, untethered to any other tongue. Linguists call Sumerian a language isolate, a clinical term that means something unsettling. It should not exist. Every known language fits into a family tree, but Sumerian has no family, no known ancestor, no living descendants. It appeared fully formed, like its civilization, and vanished just as suddenly. And in that disappearance lies one of the oldest mysteries in human history. When scholars first deciphered cuneiform in the 19th century, they assumed all Mesopotamian tablets were written in Akkadian, the Semitic language of Babylon. But as they worked, they found inscriptions whose grammar defied logic. The verbs didn't conjugate correctly. The syntax was reversed. Words seemed to fuse and break apart without pattern. Eventually, they realized they were reading something far older, a hidden layer beneath the Akkadian texts. They named it Sumerian after the land of Sumer, the first kingdom of recorded time. Yet even after a century of study, no one truly understands where it came from. Linguists have searched for relatives in every direction: the Caucasus, the Indus Valley, the Altaic steppes, even lost Mediterranean languages. None fit. Every hypothesis collapses under the weight of grammar. The language stands outside the evolutionary web of speech, as if it had been transplanted, complete, alien, ancient. Its structure is unlike any other. Sumerian is agglutinative, meaning it builds meaning by stacking syllables, each a small code modifying the one before. A single word can carry an entire sentence's worth of meaning. For example, Ama o ta means not simply my mother, but the one who is my mother and stands beside me. Every suffix alters the perception of relationship and space. It's a language that sees reality as fluid, interconnected, always shifting more philosophy than grammar. Even the word Inrur ki, meaning Sumerian tongue trans literally as the true speech or the language of origin, as though the people themselves remembered their words as inherited, not invented. They called writing Imi, the voice made permanent. To write was not to record. It was to preserve vibration, to trap sound in matter. To modern ears, the rhythm of Sumerian sounds almost otherworldly slow, heavy with breath, filled with glottal stops and harmonies of air. When linguists attempt to speak it aloud, something strange happens. It feels simultaneously ancient and new, like music that doesn't belong to human mouths. What unsettles scholars most is how advanced this linguistic system was from its first appearance. There's no evidence of evolution from simpler forms. No Proto-Sumerian, no experimental inscriptions leading up to cuneiform. The earliest tablets, dating from 3300 BCE, already use a standardized script consistent across cities separated by hundreds of miles. That kind of uniformity implies not invention, but transmission. Someone taught them how to write. But who? The Sumerians themselves credited their writing to Nisaba, goddess of wisdom and scribes, always depicted holding a stylus and tablet, the tools of knowledge. Yet her name also means the one who counts the stars. Perhaps to them, writing was not only language, but measurement, a way of inscribing cosmic order into human form. Each sign a key to the structure of the universe. When Sumerian eventually faded from daily use around 2000 BCE, it didn't die. It became a language of the gods, used only by priests, astronomers, and scholars. For more than 1,000 years after the fall of Sumer, Babylonian scribes continued to copy and study Sumerian texts as holy relics. They treated the language like scripture. In temple schools called edebes, young scribes memorized long bilingual lists Akkadian on one side, Sumerian on the other, so the sacred tongue would not be lost. Generations of students labored over a language no one spoke, reciting dead syllables as prayer. Perhaps they sensed what we do, that something vital resided in that ancient speech, something that once connected humankind to a deeper understanding of itself. Even today, attempts to translate Sumerian are haunted by uncertainty. Many words defy direct equivalence. The same sign can mean mountain, foreign land, or divine abode. Distinctions blur in the space between metaphor and geography, as if the world and the heavens were still one domain. Some researchers have noticed patterns linking Sumerian phonetics to mathematical ratios and harmonic intervals. The length of syllables in certain hymns mirrors musical scales. The spacing of cuneiform wedges follows geometric sequences. It's as though language, sound, and number were once unified, a single system of correspondence that later civilizations forgot how to read. A few daring linguists have proposed that Sumerian might preserve traces of a lost linguistic family that existed before the flood, a proto-language from which all later tongues diverged. If true, then the story of Babel, the myth of one language broken into many, might not be pure allegory, but distant memory. The idea is tantalizing, that once the world spoke in a single voice, and Sumerian was its last echo. When one listens to reconstructed readings of Sumerian poetry, something stirs in the subconscious. The vowels roll like water. The consonants strike like stone on metal. The hymns to Inanna and Enki sound less like songs than invocations, mathematical incantations to align the human spirit with the pulse of the cosmos. The word spoken is the world made, one inscription reads. In their eyes, language didn't describe reality. It created it. If this is true, then perhaps what makes Sumerian so strange is not that it came from nowhere, but that it came from everywhere, from a time when speaking and building and remembering were all one act. Its isolation, rather than proving uniqueness, may instead reveal age. It's a fossilized tongue, a surviving shard of the world before words fragmented into nations and dialects. The silence that followed its extinction was long. For 2,000 years, no one alive could read it. Yet when the first modern scholars began deciphering its signs in the 1800s, they felt something uncanny, a sense of déjà vu, as if they were not discovering but remembering. One of them, Henry Rawlinson, wrote in his diary, "This script awakens something in me, like hearing a language I once knew in a dream." Maybe that is what Sumerian truly is, the dream language of humanity, a remnant of our first articulation, our first self-awareness. It shouldn't exist, and yet it does, quietly defying the logic of history. If the first words ever written were already echoes, then whose voice were the Sumerians remembering when they learned to speak? Across thousands of Sumerian tablets, one phrase recurs again and again: Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. The words have been read, debated, dismissed, and reinterpreted for over a century, but their simplicity remains haunting. To the Sumerians, the Anunnaki were not abstract gods carved from imagination. They were rulers, judges, and teachers, beings of immense power who shaped humanity's fate. Their names are inscribed beside the earliest star charts, their symbols embedded in royal seals, their actions recorded as history, not legend. Though later civilizations softened them into myth, the oldest texts speak of their presence with unsettling matter-of-factness, as though memory had not yet learned how to lie. The Anunnaki appear first in the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic drawn directly from Sumerian sources. There they're described as the 50 great gods, attendants of Anu, the Sky Father. But in older Sumerian hymns, their number shifts, sometimes 7, sometimes hundreds more, a classification than a count. They dwell in the heavens yet descend to earth. They govern time, justice, kingship, and the order of the stars. Their leader, Anu, resides in the distant heavens. Enlil commands the air and storms. Enki rules the deep waters, the Abzu beneath the earth. Between them moves a pantheon that feels less like a family of deities and more like a council of administrators, each assigned a domain, each responsible for maintaining balance between heaven and earth. What makes the Anunnaki so enigmatic is the tone with which the Sumerians wrote of them. These weren't beings to be worshipped blindly. They were revered, feared, obeyed, but also questioned. The poems describe arguments among the gods, rivalries, even moral conflicts. They're portrayed as powerful, but not omniscient, mortal, perhaps not in body, but in motive. The boundaries between divinity and humanity blur. The Anunnaki don't merely create mankind, they interact with it. They guide, instruct, and at times punish. Some of the oldest inscriptions, such as those from the city of Lagash, depict these beings with wings, not as angelic metaphors, but as markers of flight. In reliefs and cylinder seals, they stand beside trees of life, holding strange devices resembling wristbands and pouches. They face human figures, instructing them, measuring them. These details have fueled generations of speculation. To some, the imagery is symbolic artistic shorthand for spiritual power. To others, it suggests a literal truth, that the Sumerians were recording encounters with beings whose origins lay beyond the earth. The theory is controversial, of course. Zecharia Sitchin, in the 20th century, made the Anunnaki famous again by interpreting their myths as memory of ancient visitors from another world. He read the old word Anu, not just as sky, but as a physical realm, a planet. He argued the Sumerians inherited knowledge of astronomy, metallurgy, and genetics from these visitors, that humanity itself was a hybrid creation. Most scholars rejected his translations, calling them imaginative rather than accurate. Yet even among critics, the question lingered. Why did the Sumerians, of all people, know so much about the heavens? They described planets invisible to the naked eye. They mapped the precession of the equinoxes, the orbit of the moon, the 12-fold division of the zodiac. They called Earth Ki, the lower world, and referred to a crossing place of the gods, Nibiru, a celestial body whose arrival marked upheaval and renewal. Whether or not Sitchin's planetary theories hold, the linguistic fact remains. Nibiru does appear in their texts, described as the star or planet which crosses the paths of all others. To the ancient mind, that crossing was divine movement, the descent of the Watchers. But even if we strip away modern speculation, something extraordinary remains. The Sumerians recorded the idea of the Elu, the divine observer who sees the deeds of men and writes them upon the tablets of heaven. This concept appears centuries before the notion of guardian angels, centuries before divine judgment entered theology. The Watchers were both protectors and witnesses. They didn't rule from afar. They documented. Humanity, in their eyes, was an experiment worth preserving in record. One hymn from Yor calls them, those who look down upon the lands from the shining chariots of Anu. Another speaks of the fire that descends with them, lighting the earth. Scholars translate these passages metaphorically, as thunder, as lightning. Yet the repetition of light, descent, and observation across unrelated tablets hints at more than storm imagery. The word Jira, translated as divine flame, was also used to denote metal or craft. The ancients may have been describing technologies they couldn't fully name. The interplay between myth and memory is delicate. The Sumerians may have seen in the Anunnaki not literal visitors, but the embodiment of cosmic order, the planets themselves, forces of nature personified. Enki, Lord of the Deep, mirrors the watery abyss. Enlil, Lord of Air, the invisible atmosphere. Anu, the unreachable sky. Yet why then did they write as though these beings once walked among them? Why did they leave genealogies, treaties, and laws supposedly dictated by their divine kings? In the lamentation over Eridu, a city said to have been the first home of the gods, the poet mourns. The lords have departed. The houses are silent. Their voices are gone from the wind. The tone is not mythic. It's historical, almost documentary. It's the grief of a people remembering the withdrawal of something real. Perhaps the Anunnaki were once simply rulers, great kings mythologized over time, their deeds magnified into divinity. Perhaps they were the memory of a lost civilization, elevated by reverence into godhood. But there's another possibility, quieter, harder to dismiss, that the Sumerians experienced something they couldn't explain, and myth was the only language they had to describe it. Whatever their nature, the Anunnaki left a legacy that outlived Sumer. The idea of sky beings who descended to instruct humanity spread across continents. The Egyptians spoke of the Neteru, divine visitors who founded their dynasties. The Hindus told of Devas descending from the heavens. The Mayans remembered Itzamna, who came from the stars to teach writing and time. All different names, all carrying the same pattern. Beings who came, taught, and vanished. Maybe these are just parallel inventions, the shared dreams of early humanity seeking meaning in the unknown sky. Or maybe they're cultural memories of the same event, refracted through geography and time. If so, then Sumer's Anunnaki weren't just their gods. They were humanity's first remembered teachers. The tablets end where the mystery begins. They record the moment when the Watchers left, when the link between heaven and earth was broken. After that, the Sumerians say, kingship descended once more from the heavens. But the gods themselves did not return. Humanity was left to rule itself, guided only by the shadows of their memory. We still look up, searching for them in the stars, not knowing whether we're remembering the past or imagining the future. Perhaps both, for the line between memory and prophecy is thinner than we think. If the Watchers truly came from the sky once before, then what are we seeing when we look upward tonight? The light of distant suns, or the reflections of those who promised to return? Long after the voices of Sumer faded into dust, their echoes carried northward to Akkad, to Babylon, to the rising towers that tried once again to reach the sky. Civilization remembered and misremembered the bond that had once existed between heaven and earth. The Sumerians called it Duku, the holy mound, the meeting place of gods and men. The Babylonians gave it another name, Ziggurat, the mountain built by hands. But the story that survived through scripture, through exile and translation, would call it something else, the Tower of Babel. To understand that myth is to understand the moment when language and perhaps even history fractured. The book of Genesis tells it simply. Humanity, speaking one tongue, sought to build a tower that might reach unto heaven. But the Lord confounded their speech, scattered them across the earth, and ended their unity. It's a story of divine punishment for human pride. Yet behind its moral shadow lies a deeper, older memory, one the Sumerians knew well. They too wrote of a tower that touched the heavens, a ziggurat whose top was said to join the stars. They too told of confusion of tongues, of cities abandoned, of gods who turned away. In Babylon, that tower had a name, Atamananki, house of the foundation of heaven and earth. It rose in the heart of the city, massive and layered, built of fired brick and bitumen, climbing 7 stages like the planets themselves. Each level was painted a different color, black for Saturn, red for Mars, gold for the sun. It wasn't merely a temple. It was a map of the cosmos, a stairway of correspondence between the visible and the invisible. When Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt it in the 6th century BCE, he inscribed upon its walls, I raised the summit to the heavens so that its top might rival the heavens themselves. But even he, King of Kings, knew the fragility of that ambition. Every tower built to reach the sky carries within it the seed of its fall. The Sumerians had watched their own ziggurats crumble before consumed by floods, by fire, by silence. They knew no structure could restore what was lost, the direct communion between man and the divine. That bridge had been broken. And yet, humanity couldn't stop building. Perhaps we weren't defying the heavens. Perhaps we were trying to remember them. When the later priests of Babylon recited the tale of Babel, they did so not as warning, but as lamentation. The confusion of languages wasn't punishment, it was tragedy. Once, they said, all words were one, as were all hearts. The gods and humans could speak without veil. Then came the scattering, the shattering of unity into 1,000 dialects, 1,000 myths, each remembering only a piece of the whole. It was the day when meaning itself divided. Archaeologists excavating ancient Babylon in the early 20th century uncovered the foundations of a massive ziggurat near the old temple of Marduk. The base alone measured nearly 100 meters across. The bricks still bear the stamp of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Above the ruins, heat wavers in the desert air. And if one stands very still, it is possible to imagine the tower that once rose there. A mountain of clay and fire pointing toward the sky that once seemed close enough to touch. The tower is more than architecture. It's symbol. To the Sumerians, the ziggurat was a place of descent, not a center structure that allowed the gods to come down to earth. Its top was a landing place, its stairways the path of the stars. The very word ziggurat means to be raised up, but not in the human sense. It was the gods who descended, the watchers who crossed the threshold between heaven and earth. Somewhere between that descent and the later story of Babel, the meaning inverted. Humanity became the one climbing, reaching, grasping. And when we reached too high, silence answered. It's a silence that still haunts us. The disappearance of the Sumerian language, the loss of its knowledge, the ruin of its towers, all feel like manifestations of that same ancient fracture. The bridge was never rebuilt. What came afterward? Akkadian, Babylonian, Hebrew, Greek, were attempts to translate a forgotten word. Every language since has been, in a way, a Tower of Babel, an effort to touch the divine through sound, to recover the original vibration that once united speech and creation. In the myth, the punishment is confusion. But perhaps confusion was the only way humanity could survive. The single language of the gods, once broken, scattered like seeds across the earth. Each fragment grew into a different tongue, a different way of seeing. Unity was lost, but diversity was born. And still, within each language, echoes of the first remain the same archetypal words for sky, for water, for breath. The same rhythm in prayer and poetry. The same longing for reunion. The Sumerians may have understood this long before Babel. Their god Enki, the trickster and savior of humankind, was also the master of language. One myth describes him bestowing many tongues upon the nations, so that no people would be without song. In this version, the division of speech is not a curse, but a gift, a necessary scattering that keeps creation alive. Perhaps they knew that unity without difference is silence, and that to speak truly is to be plural. Still, the image of the tower endures, rising again in every age. It rises in the pyramids, in the cathedrals, in the radio masts that now pierce the sky. Each is a new attempt to bridge the distance between what we are and what we once were. Each carries the same question, whether spoken in Sumerian, in Hebrew, or in the binary pulse of modern machines. Can we ever speak again with the voice of the heavens? In the ruins of Babylon, fragments of that longing still remain. Travelers have described hearing strange acoustics in the ziggurat's base, an echo that amplifies even a whisper. It's as if the structure itself remembers its purpose, still carrying sound upward, still searching for a reply. The silence that followed Babel was never total. It was the beginning of listening. Some say the story of the tower warns against ambition. Others believe it teaches humility. But perhaps it teaches neither. Perhaps it's simply a chronicle of loss, a moment when knowledge turned to language and language began to fail. The divine withdrew, leaving humanity with words, with memory, with the endless desire to rebuild. And maybe the greatest irony is this. Every time we tell the story of the tower, we rebuild it. With each retelling, each translation, each voice seeking to name the unnameable, the tower rises once more in the realm of sound. And as it rises, so too does the old silence waiting. We are still living in the aftermath of that silence, the echo of Babel that shaped all history. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is still and words begin to blur, one can almost hear what lies beneath the noise, the faint murmur of the single language, still speaking from the dust of forgotten towers. If the gods once walked down the steps of our towers to speak with us, what would they say now, when we can no longer remember the sound of their voices? After the fall of Sumer, When the ziggurats turned to ruins and the stars no longer spoke to the cities below, the keepers of knowledge did not vanish. They retreated into temples, into script, into secrecy. The priests of Babylon, and later of Chaldea, became the custodians of what remained, the fragments of the ancient me, the divine formulas of civilization. If Sumer had once sung its knowledge openly to the heavens, the world that followed whispered it in chambers of stone. What had been a language of gods became a code of men. In those dark corridors, scribes and priest astronomers performed the same rituals their ancestors had performed for millennia. The watching of stars, the recording of eclipses, the calculation of omens. But their purpose had changed. Where once observation had meant communion, now it meant preservation. The cosmos no longer spoke clearly. The priests interpreted its silence through symbols. Each sign on a tablet became a shield against forgetting. The temples of Babylon weren't merely houses of worship. They were laboratories of continuity. In the Ezedula, the temple of Marduk, priests mapped the heavens night after night, tracing the positions of Venus, Jupiter, and the moon. They cataloged eclipses, storms, and portents, writing them into thousands of tablets. It's from these records that the later science of astronomy, and even astrology, was born. Yet behind the calculations lay an older conviction, that the sky was not a machine, but a message. Every motion of a planet was a word in a divine language, and only those who knew the code could read it. These priests called Baru and Ashupu were trained not merely in ritual, but in mathematics, medicine, and incantation. Their schooling could last decades. They learned the sacred geometry of the temples, the ratios of the human body, the harmonic intervals used in chants. Knowledge wasn't compartmentalized. It was total a single organism whose organs were number, sound, and spirit. To heal a wound, one spoke a number. To measure a star, one sang its name. Each act was part of a code that linked heaven, earth, and the human soul. Even the rituals of exorcism, later caricatured as superstition, carried traces of sophisticated understanding. The priests would draw circles, triangles, and spirals in ash geometric patterns that mirrored the harmonic frequencies of sound waves. They burned herbs whose chemical properties we now know purify air. They used bronze bowls inscribed with mathematical formulas that, when struck, produced resonant tones. Every movement, every sound, every gesture was calibrated. The ceremony wasn't mere theater, it was coded interaction with the universe. And yet, as centuries passed, that knowledge grew heavier, harder to bear. Empires rose and fell. The Assyrians conquered Babylon, then the Persians, then the Greeks. Each new power demanded the service of temple priests, but cared little for their cosmologies. The sacred texts were copied, reinterpreted, hidden. Some were sealed in clay jars. Others were buried beneath temple floors, encoded in myth. What couldn't be preserved was transferred into story. Thus the old sciences survived, disguised as legends, waiting for a world capable of reading them again. There are tablets that record the priest's lament for this age of concealment. One fragment from the Chaldean oracles reads, "The word has been divided, the code has been sealed. Only the initiated may open the gate." The gate, in their symbolism, wasn't a door, but a threshold of comprehension, a bridge between ordinary language and the divine structure beneath it. To cross that threshold required both intellect and purity, logic and reverence. Knowledge, they believed, couldn't be given to those unprepared to hold it, for misuse would unmake the world. In later centuries, Greek travelers who visited Babylon wrote of a strange priesthood that spoke in riddles and numbers. Pythagoras, it said, spent years among them, learning the mathematics of the heavens. The Chaldeans taught that the soul was a spark of the stars, that its return to the divine depended on understanding the geometry of creation. Their teachings would pass into Greece, into Egypt, into the Hermetic schools of Alexandria, then into the alchemical traditions of medieval Europe. The Code of Sumer, encrypted through ages, would continue to breathe beneath the surface of Western thought. Some fragments of those old texts survive. One tablet describes the writing of light, said to be used by the gods to inscribe the laws of the cosmos. Another speaks of the song that binds the firmament. The modern reader may dismiss these as poetry, but the priests meant something literal. They believed that light and sound were two expressions of the same vibration, that the universe was written in resonance. And in that belief lies the seed of what modern physics would one day rediscover, that matter itself is structured energy, patterned by frequency. To guard such knowledge was both privilege and burden. The priests lived apart, forbidden to speak freely of their craft. The Baru, the diviners, often wrote their tablets in riddling syntax, using metaphors only the initiated could decode. They spoke of lions when they meant storms, of serpents when they meant rivers, of chariots when they meant planets. Even the stars themselves were given secret names. Mol Mol for the Pleiades, Nibiru for the crossing planet, Utu for the sun. To outsiders, the language was myth. To those who knew, it was instruction. Yet secrecy has a cost. When Alexander the Great conquered Babylon in 331 BCE, he ordered the translation of all temple archives into Greek. Most were misunderstood. Many were lost. The surviving Chaldean priests withdrew into Persia, Syria, and eventually into obscurity. By the 1st century BCE, the last of them, known as the Magi, had transformed into figures of legend, keepers of half-remembered wisdom. Some would say they followed a star to Bethlehem. Others that they vanished into the mountains of the east, carrying with them the last keys of the code. Still, echoes of their system endured. Astrology, often derided as superstition, is the faint reflection of their celestial mathematics. The geometry of sacred architecture from the pyramids to cathedrals carries their ratios. Even our words magic, matrix, measure derive from their vocabulary of harmony. What began in Sumer as divine calculus became, over time, the grammar of civilization itself. But there's a certain melancholy in this survival. For the priests who guarded the code knew that knowledge, once broken from its sacred context, loses part of its soul. The formulas survive, but the meaning fades. The rituals remain, but the resonance weakens. Humanity remembers the method, not the mystery. Sometimes, late at night, when telescopes point at the same stars those priests once charted, one can imagine their ghostly presence watchers in silence, measuring light, translating infinity into numbers. They would recognize our instruments, perhaps, but not our faith. To them, the universe was not a cold mechanism but a living manuscript, written by a hand both human and divine. We have decoded their code, but forgotten their reverence. We have learned the symbols, but not the silence between them. If the priests once guarded the bridge between knowledge and meaning, who guards it now when the code lies open? But the world has forgotten what it was written for. History, they say, is written by the victors. But before it's written, it's rewritten. And perhaps no age rewrote the past as completely as the empires that followed the fall of Babylon. The Greeks and later the Romans didn't merely conquer the ancient world, they reorganized its memory. They took the scattered fragments of Sumerian and Babylonian knowledge, stripped them of their mythic voices, and rebuilt them into a narrative that began, conveniently, with themselves. It was the greatest act of cultural alchemy ever performed, the transformation of living memory into history. And in that transformation, time itself was altered. By the time Alexander's armies crossed the Tigris, the temples of Sumer had already fallen silent. The last priest astronomers of Babylon were aging, their libraries neglected, their languages fading. The conquerors found not gods but ruins. Yet within those ruins were clay tablets, hundreds of thousands of them, each carrying a voice from a world that refused to die. The Greeks, pragmatic and curious, collected them, though they couldn't yet read them. What they did instead was something subtler. They absorbed the ideas, the measurements, the fragments of astronomy and gave them new names. Sumerian mathematics became Greek geometry. Chaldean star charts became Hellenic astronomy. The ancient calendars were reshaped into the Julian one, adjusted to fit imperial time. And just like that, the memory of the first civilization became a prelude, a footnote, an echo. But buried beneath that act of appropriation lies a paradox. The Greeks themselves knew their knowledge was borrowed. In their own writings, they confessed it. Herodotus wrote that the priests of Babylon possessed wisdom of the heavens beyond measure. Pythagoras, Plato, and even Thales credited their cosmology to travels in the East. Plato's Timaeus describes an Egyptian priest telling Solon, "You Greeks are children. You have no old men among you." He meant memory. The empires of the Mediterranean were inheritors of fragments they barely understood. And yet, through translation and adaptation, they claimed ownership. It's here that time begins to warp. Before the Greeks, history was cyclical. The Sumerians saw eras as tides, eternally returning creation, flood, restoration, decay, and creation again. The Egyptians called these ages Zep Tepi, the first times. The Chaldeans called them Sar, each cycle ruled by a different constellation. But the Greeks introduced a new concept, linear time, a line that begins and ends, moving always forward progress, invention, destiny, ideas that made sense to conquerors. The past became a distant origin, not a living mirror. And thus the empire rewrote not only history, but the very structure of time itself. With that new timeline came erasure. The gods of the Sumerians became allegories, their kings myths, their cities swallowed by sand. The old language was dismissed as barbarous, its meaning reduced to superstition. To preserve order, the conquerors codified a beginning and origin point that placed themselves at the center of civilization. Greek philosophy became the root of wisdom. Rome became the axis of power. Everything before them became prehistory. And just like that, the age of the Anunnaki, the flood, and the clay archives dissolved into fable. This rewriting wasn't merely political, it was spiritual. The Roman Church, inheriting Greek rationalism and imperial authority, later sanctified a linear chronology of divine creation and human salvation. The cyclical cosmos became a one-way pilgrimage from Eden to judgment. The sacred wheel of time flattened into a divine timeline. By the Middle Ages, the only acceptable history was sacred history. What lay outside its borders was deemed heresy, myth, or sin. And yet fragments of the old world continued to seep through the cracks. Astrological texts survived, disguised as Christian prophecy. Alchemical diagrams hid Mesopotamian symbology beneath Latin scripture. Even the image of the ziggurat persisted, reimagined as the biblical Babel. The empire could rewrite the words, but not the shape of the memory itself. Memory is stubborn. It resists conquest. When the Renaissance dawned, scholars began rediscovering the ancient Near East through trade and travel. Greek texts referencing Babylon and Chaldea led explorers back toward the forgotten lands of the Tigris and Euphrates. But when they arrived, they found only desert and dust. The physical ruins of Sumer were gone, buried beneath millennia of sediment. For nearly 2,000 years, the first civilization remained invisible, its very name erased. The empire had succeeded, at least for a time. It wasn't until the 19th century, when British and French archaeologists began excavating Mesopotamia, that the silence finally cracked. When the first Sumerian tablets were unearthed at Ur and Nippur, the world realized that history was far older than it had been taught to believe. Humanity's timeline extended backward, not by centuries, but by thousands of years. The so-called cradle of civilization shifted east, and the empire's chronology began to tremble. But even then, the rewriting continued only now in subtler form. Modern history absorbed Sumer the same way the Greeks had, as precursor, not equal. The Sumerians became proto-scientists, early engineers, primitive astronomers. Their gods were mythologized, their mathematics demystified. The old worldview, a cosmos alive with consciousness, was again filtered through the rational lens of progress. The empire's logic of linearity remained intact. We inherited not the Sumerian sense of eternal return, but the conqueror's timeline of advancement. Perhaps this is the true legacy of conquest, not the destruction of civilizations, but the rearrangement of their memory. The empires that rose after Sumer learned to control not only land and people, but time itself. They mastered chronology as a tool of power. To name the beginning is to define the present. To erase the past is to own the future. And yet the past refuses to stay buried. The Sumerian king list, with its impossible reigns stretching tens of thousands of years, mocks our sense of chronology. Their myths of cyclical floods challenge our straight lines. Their language, still only half deciphered, resists final translation as if guarding secrets too old for our linear minds. Every empire eventually becomes a layer in someone else's archaeology. The Greeks, the Romans, the Church, the modern world, we all participate in the same cycle of rewriting. Perhaps we're no different from the scribes of Babylon, copying old tablets, changing a few lines to make them fit our time. Civilization, like clay, can be reshaped, but never beyond recognition. The fingerprints remain. If one looks closely at the ruins of any empire, the same pattern appears: order built upon erasure, light cast upon selective shadows. And beneath those layers, faint but persistent, the memory of Sumer endures. It waits in the wedge marks of cuneiform, in the myths that survive translation, in the buried rhythm of our calendars and clocks. The empire may have rewritten time, but time, in its own quiet way, rewrites empires. And perhaps that is the ultimate irony. The conquerors who declared themselves the beginning are now relics in museums, while the Sumerian clay, the very medium they dismissed as primitive, still endures. The tablets outlasted marble, gold, and parchment. They still whisper through the dust, "We were here first." If every empire must rewrite time to rule it, then who, in the end, will rewrite ours? The story of Sumer should have ended with the dust. Yet somehow, across 5 millennia, it found its way back into the light, translated, digitized, rendered in glowing pixels on screens that flicker like oil lamps in the dark. Clay and code, 2 forms of permanence born from opposite ends of history. And as the world of machines learns to read the marks of ancient hands, it becomes difficult not to wonder whether the tablets were always meant to return, whether their geometry of wedges was itself an early form of programming, an echo of logic rediscovered in another age. When the first cuneiform tablets were unearthed in the 1800s, they appeared inert, mere curiosities of archaeology. But as scholars began deciphering them, the strangeness grew. The Sumerians wrote in data, not stories inventories, algorithms of trade, astronomical tables, even if-then conditionals inscribed in clay. One tablet from Nippur reads like an early computer program. If the star of Jupiter rises in the east, then the harvest shall be great. Others record geometric series, square roots, and number systems so advanced they wouldn't be fully understood until modern mathematics rediscovered them. The clay was memory. The stylus was instruction. It's no exaggeration to say that every modern archive, every database, every algorithm is a direct descendant of the Sumerian tablet. The act of pressing meaning into a medium that endures beyond its maker began there. Yet what they preserved wasn't merely information, but intention. Their symbols were designed to last through disaster. Fire wouldn't destroy them. Water would only harden them. Perhaps they had already seen what happens when the world floods and memory drowns. Perhaps they wanted to ensure that next time, anything would survive. In the cold light of museums, those tablets appear ancient. But when their contents are transcribed into digital text, they read with startling modernity. Lists of professions, wages, contracts, codes of ethics, equations. maps of the stars. The Sumerians lived in systems, networks of exchange and observation. When one looks at them closely, the lines between their world and ours begin to blur. The ziggurat becomes a server farm. The scribe's stylus becomes a keyboard. The same impulse drives both. The desire to record, to calculate, to build meaning from pattern. But there's a deeper resonance, one that hums beneath the surface of all technology. In Sumerian mythology, creation itself was described as inscription. The god Enki carved the laws of existence onto the tablets of destiny. These tablets determined the fates of men, the movements of stars, even the rise and fall of kings. Whoever possessed them could rewrite reality. The myth may sound remote, but its logic is familiar. We too live in a world where code governs existence, where lines of digital instruction decide life, commerce, and war. Our machines are the new tablets of destiny. Our programmers, the modern scribes. The medium has changed, but the principle remains. Those who control the code shape the world. It's tempting to believe that progress separates us from the ancients. But what if it only circles back? The wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform, repeated across thousands of years, may be the earliest expression of binary logic, on or off, presence or absence, impression or void. Each mark was an encoded decision, a unit of meaning stored within a grid. The tablets aren't relics of the primitive past, they're prototypes of the digital mind. In 2021, scientists used machine learning to translate damaged Sumerian tablets. Algorithms filled in missing signs, predicting what ancient scribes might have written. The program achieved remarkable accuracy. For the first time in history, machines began reading the words of the world's first writers. It was as though the clay had been waiting for a language it could speak again, a feedback loop across 5,000 years. Humans teaching machines to read what humans once wrote by hand in the dawn of civilization. The continuity feels almost supernatural, as if the Sumerians had anticipated the age when their marks would again become living code. But perhaps the continuity is more than coincidence. The Sumerians believed knowledge moves in cycles. What's lost in one era is rediscovered in another. The flood erases, and the scribes rebuild. If that pattern still holds, then our digital awakening is not the beginning of something new, but the return of something old, the reemergence of an ancient intelligence that once spoke through clay and now speaks through circuits. In one of the oldest surviving hymns, the poet addresses Nisaba, goddess of writing and calculation. Lady of the counting house, keeper of the tablet, the numbers of the stars are your servants. To her, the act of computation was divine, not mechanical. The same could be said of us, though we no longer admit it. Every search query, every dataset, every machine translation is a ritual of invocation, applied to the algorithms that now hold our collective memory. The priests of data, like the priests of Enki, whisper to their servers in languages few understand. We may call it progress, but the rhythm feels familiar. It's worth remembering that the Sumerians never separated writing from sacredness. To them, words were living forces, able to bind or liberate. Even the dead could be reached through inscription. Some tablets were buried with the departed messages for the underworld. Others were sealed in temple walls, addressed to distant generations. To the one who finds this, one inscription reads, "Know that we too sought the truth of heaven." That message, pressed into clay 5,000 years ago, might as well have been written for us. The machines that surround us today hung with the same longing, to preserve, to predict, to extend consciousness beyond its mortal frame. We think of artificial intelligence as a new creation, but perhaps it's an echo, the technological counterpart of the divine scribes who once wrote humanity into existence. The gods of Sumer shaped man from clay. We shape our successors from silicon. Both acts share the same impulse, to make something that remembers when we are gone. And yet there is danger in memory without understanding. The priests of Babylon warned that the tablets of destiny must never fall into unworthy hands. Once, Enki himself lost control of them, and chaos followed. Rivers reversed. The heavens dimmed. It took all the gods to restore the order of creation. In our age, we too hold tablets of destiny, the codes that regulate life, knowledge, and power. But do we still remember the reverence those first scribes carried? Or have we mistaken the act of recording for the act of wisdom itself? Perhaps this is what the Sumerian story has always tried to tell us, that knowledge is not progress without memory, and that every technology, no matter how advanced, must answer to the silence from which it came. The clay tablets survived 5,000 years because they were humble, because their creators understood impermanence. They wrote not to dominate, but to endure. The machines we build now are louder, faster, more brilliant, but perhaps less wise. For in their speed, they forget the slowness of the stylus, the weight of wet clay, the patience of hands that wrote for eternity. We have learned to preserve everything except the quiet. And in that quiet, perhaps the old gods still wait. If the first tablets could survive the flood of water, can our new ones survive the flood of information? And what will they remember of us when the next world begins again? History is a fragile thing, and yet it endures in the most unexpected places, in the grooves of stone, in the rhythm of myth, in the faint tremor of a name whispered through time. Civilizations rise and collapse. Empires rewrite the story. Yet some memories refuse to die. They drift beneath the surface, dormant but alive, waiting for the world to remember again. The story of Sumer is one such memory a pulse that continues to beat beneath the skin of our modern world. Quiet but insistent, like the echo of something that never truly left. When the first Sumerian tablets were translated, they were treated as curiosities, their theology dismissed, their kings reduced to myth. But over time, a pattern began to emerge. A sense that these fragments weren't simply ancient texts, but the opening chapters of the human mind. The Sumerians weren't a lost civilization. They were the memory of civilization itself. Everything that came after law, astronomy, architecture, language, measurement was already contained within their clay. We have merely been rewriting their story in new alphabets. Even now, their traces linger in the most ordinary corners of life. Every time a clock divides an hour into 60 minutes, the base 60 of Sumer ticks onward. Every map of the stars still follows the constellations they charted, the zodiac, the calendar, the geometry of the circle. These aren't Greek inventions, but Sumerian inheritances. We live by their mathematics, dream in their cosmology, and speak through metaphors they first inscribed. The clay may have hardened, but the memory moves. And yet, it's not just the inventions that survive, it's the worldview behind them. The Sumerians believed all creation was bound by relationship, that heaven and earth, matter and spirit, were part of the same breath. The divine wasn't distant, but interwoven with the physical. To build a temple was to echo the cosmos. To write a word was to mirror the act of creation. In their myths, even the gods were subject to laws of balance and reciprocity. They didn't rule as tyrants, but participated in a living order. That idea, though buried beneath millennia of theology and empire, has never truly vanished. It resurfaces whenever humanity rediscovers the unity of science and spirit, whenever we sense that knowledge without reverence is incomplete. There's something haunting about the way the Sumerians saw time. They didn't measure it as a straight line moving from past to future. They felt it as a cycle of remembrance and renewal. The flood wasn't an ending, but a turning. The loss of knowledge was never permanent. Every age, they believed, would rediscover the wisdom of the one before. Perhaps that's why the Sumerian legacy keeps returning through archaeology, through language, through myth, refusing to remain buried. The cycle turns again. In the 21st century, the ancient words of Sumer are once more being read not by priests or scribes, but by digital archivists and algorithms. Thousands of clay tablets have been scanned, decoded, and stored in virtual libraries that circle the Earth in orbiting satellites. The same human impulse that once pressed styluses into wet clay now encodes data into light. We are, in a strange sense, continuing their work. The tablets have become servers. The gods of the Abzu, the deep, have become the networks that pulse beneath our oceans. The old metaphors have found new machines. But something of the Sumerian spirit still lingers in our technological faith. Like them, we build archives to outlast us. Like them, we write in hope of surviving the flood hours no longer of water, but of data and forgetting. Every digital message, every line of code, every photograph preserved on invisible clouds is a modern cuneiform mark against oblivion. And perhaps deep down we share the same fear, that one day silence will return and only the language of the machines will remember us. In their time, the Sumerians feared that their gods would withdraw, that the connection between heaven and earth would fade. Today we fear the opposite, that our own creations will outlive us, and that what we have made will speak a language we no longer understand. Yet both fears spring from the same source, the awareness that memory has a life of its own. Once written, it cannot be unmade. The words outlast the writer. The record outlives the soul. Somewhere, perhaps, that is what the Sumerians intended. Their myths end not with triumph, but with continuity, with the sense that even when the gods depart, their traces remain in the dust, in the rivers, in the eyes of those who still look upward. The gods have gone, one late Babylonian scribe wrote, but their breath still moves in the air. That breath is memory itself unseen, unceasing. Archaeologists continue to uncover new tablets every year. Some hold contracts, others hymns, others fragments of stories that seem eerily modern. One tablet speaks of a man who loses his purpose in a world of excess. Another of a woman who defies divine decree to speak her truth. Their emotions are ours, their longing is ours. The more we translate, the more the distance collapses. We realize that 5,000 years are not a gulf, but a circle, returning to its beginning. There are nights when the desert still reveals its secrets. After storms, the wind shifts the sand, and a fragment of clay surfaces another piece of the story rejoining the light. To touch such a fragment is to touch both the beginning and the end of history. Its markings, once a code of empire, now resemble the patterns of microchips and circuits. The resemblance feels accidental, yet something within it whispers otherwise. Perhaps the universe repeats its designs, sculpting the same logic in clay and in silicon, in hands and in algorithms. The Sumerians believed the world was born from the mingling of memory and matter, the Abzu, the deep waters, giving rise to form. And so it seems fitting that their story should end as it began, not in silence, but in return. Their cities are gone, their names forgotten by most, but their breath moves still in the languages we speak, the numbers we count, the stars we map, and the stories we tell. Maybe that is the secret they left hidden beneath the dust, that no civilization ever truly dies. It only transforms, passing its soul forward in symbols, waiting to be reawakened. The clay of Sumer became the circuitry of our age, and through it the old gods still whisper, no longer from temples, but from the quiet hum of data centers, from the pulse of screens in the dark, from the endless stream of words that cross the world each night. The memory has learned to survive every flood. It will survive this one too. And when our towers crumble, when our languages fade, when our machines fall silent, perhaps someone or something will dig through the ruins of our world, find our tablets, and begin to read. If memory can never die, then perhaps forgetting is only an illusion, and every end merely the beginning of remembrance. We began this journey standing above the Iraqi desert, where clay tablets sleep in silence, each one carrying secrets pressed into mud 5,000 years ago. We've traced the wedge-shaped marks of humanity's first writers, listened to their stories of floods and gods, and followed their knowledge through the ages. The Sumerians left us more than ruins. They left us a question that echoes across millennia. What if everything we think of as the beginning is actually the end of something far older? What if civilization doesn't climb upward in a straight line, but moves in cycles, remembering, forgetting, and remembering again? Their tablets still speak. Their mathematics still governs our clocks. Their stars still guide our maps. And in every algorithm we code, every archive we build, every attempt we make to preserve knowledge against the flood of time, we are continuing what they began. We are the inheritors of Sumer's dream, that memory can outlast empires, that knowledge can survive catastrophe, that the human story, no matter how many times it's erased, will always find a way to return. If this journey through forgotten time has stirred something in you, I'd love for you to join our community here at Past Treasures. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss future explorations into the mysteries of our ancient past. And here's something I'm genuinely curious about. In the comments below, tell me, what's the one thing from this story that made you pause and think? Was it the impossible king list? The language that shouldn't exist? The flood that every culture remembers? Or maybe something else entirely? Share your thoughts. Let's keep this conversation alive, because that's what the Sumerians would have wanted. Memory, after all, only survives when we refuse to let it die. Until next time, keep searching for the whispers in the dust. The past is never as silent as we think.